I thought I had seen everything when it came to unreasonable homeowners association board members. But the day Brenda Morrison called the police on my tenants claiming they were squatters would redefine my entire understanding of crazy. My name is Harrison Fletcher, and I had been renting out my townhouse in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for the past 3 years. The property was in a gated community called Meadowbrook Estates, governed by what I initially thought was a reasonable HOA. I was wrong, dead wrong. It started on a Tuesday morning in March when I received a frantic call from Marcus and Sarah, the young couple who had been renting my property for the past 8 months. Marcus was barely coherent on the phone, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "Harrison, you need to get over here right now," Marcus said, the panic evident in every syllable. "There are police officers at the door, and some woman from the HOA is telling them we are illegal squatters. She is saying we broke into your property and have been living here without permission." I felt my stomach drop. What? That is insane. Where is Brenda Morrison? Is she there? Yeah, she is the one who called them. She is standing right here with this smug look on her face, telling the officers we need to be removed immediately. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door of my apartment across town. The drive to Meadowbrook Estates usually took about 20 minutes, but I made it in 12, my mind racing the entire way. Marcus and Sarah were model tenants. They paid rent on time, kept the property immaculate, and never caused any issues with the neighbors. The lease agreement was solid, signed, notarized, and filed with all the proper documentation. This had to be some kind of terrible mistake. When I pulled up to the townhouse, I saw 2 Chapel Hill police cruisers parked in the driveway, their lights still flashing. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, phones out, filming the scene. Standing on my front porch was Brenda Morrison, the HOA president, looking exactly like you would expect. She was in her mid-50s with a severe blonde bob haircut, wearing a pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and holding a leather-bound folder that I assumed contained her evidence. Marcus and Sarah stood in the doorway looking terrified. Sarah was crying, and Marcus had his arm around her protectively. 2 police officers, one older with graying hair and one younger who looked fresh out of the academy, stood between them and Brenda, looking confused. I jumped out of my car and practically ran up the walkway. "Officers, I am Harrison Fletcher. I own this property and these people are my legal tenants." Brenda whipped around to face me, her eyes narrowing. Oh, how convenient. The supposed owner shows up right on time. "Officers, do not believe a word this man says. These people have been squatting in this property for months, and when I confronted them about it, they claimed they had a lease that does not exist." The older officer held up his hand. "Madam, please, let him speak." "I have all the documentation in my car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "The lease agreement, the rental application, bank statements showing rent payments, everything. These are my tenants and they have been living here legally since last July." Brenda scoffed. "Officers, I have been the HOA president of Meadowbrook Estates for 7 years. I keep meticulous records of every property in this community. According to our files, this property has been listed as owner-occupied since Harrison Fletcher purchased it 4 years ago. There has never been any notification filed with the HOA about renters, which is a clear violation of our covenants." I felt heat rising in my face, because notification is not required. I read the HOA covenants front to back before I ever rented the property. There is no clause requiring owners to notify the board about tenants. "That is where you are wrong," Brenda said, opening her leather folder with theatrical flair. "Section 12. Paragraph 4 clearly states that any change in occupancy must be reported to the HOA board within 30 days. That section refers to changes in ownership, not tenancy, I shot back. I had my lawyer review the entire document before I signed the lease with Marcus and Sarah. The younger officer looked between us, clearly uncomfortable with being in the middle of what was turning into a property law debate. "Sir, can you provide proof of the lease agreement?" "Absolutely. Give me 1 second." I jogged back to my car and grabbed my laptop bag. Thank God I kept digital copies of everything on my cloud drive. I pulled out my laptop, opened it right there on the hood of my car, and logged into my account. Within seconds, I had the lease agreement pulled up, along with copies of the rental application, background checks, and 8 months of rent payment receipts. I carried the laptop over to the officers. "Here is everything. The lease was signed on July 1st of last year. It is a standard 12-month agreement with an option to renew. Here are the payment records showing they have paid rent on the 1st of every month without fail. Here is their rental application with references. Here is the security deposit receipt." The older officer examined the screen carefully, scrolling through each document. His expression shifted from skepticism to understanding. "This all looks legitimate to me." Brenda pushed forward, trying to see the screen. "Those could easily be forged. Anyone can create a fake document these days." "I demand you verify this information with the county records office." "Madam, these documents have digital signatures, timestamps, and bank transaction records," the officer said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This is not forged." "I do not care what it looks like," Brenda insisted, her voice rising. "These people are violating HOA rules and they need to leave immediately. If they refuse, I want them arrested for trespassing." Marcus finally spoke up, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We have done nothing wrong. We pay our rent, we follow all the rules, we do not bother anyone. This is harassment." "Harassment?" Brenda turned on him, her face flushing red. "You want to talk about harassment? You and your wife have been harassing this entire neighborhood since you moved in. Your car is too loud. Your garbage cans are always out past the designated time. You walk your dog without a leash." "Our car is a standard sedan," Sarah said, wiping tears from her face. "Our garbage cans go out on trash day like everyone else's, and our dog is always on a leash. You are making things up." "I know what I have seen," Brenda snapped. The older officer closed my laptop and handed it back to me. "Mr. Fletcher, everything appears to be in order. Your tenants have a legal right to be here." He turned to Brenda. "Madam, there is no crime being committed here. These people have a valid lease agreement." "But they are violating HOA regulations," Brenda protested. "That is a civil matter between you and the property owner," the officer said. "It is not a criminal issue. If you believe the HOA covenants have been violated, you need to pursue that through the appropriate legal channels, not by calling 911 and claiming these people are squatters." Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "So you are not going to do anything?" "There is nothing to do. No crime has been committed." The officer turned to Marcus and Sarah. "I apologize for the inconvenience. You folks have a good day." As the officers walked back to their cruisers, Brenda stood there looking stunned. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out her next move. The neighbors who had been watching started to disperse, some of them shaking their heads in disgust at Brenda's behavior. I walked up to her, keeping my voice low and controlled. "You need to stay away from my tenants. What you just did was completely out of line." "I was protecting this community," Brenda said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "You called the police and made a false report. You accused innocent people of being criminals. You could have had them arrested based on lies. I did not lie. I genuinely believed they were squatters. Based on what evidence? Did you ever once try to contact me? Did you ask to see their lease? No, you just assumed and called the police. Brenda straightened her shoulders, trying to regain her composure. As HOA president, it is my duty to investigate suspicious activity in our community. These people appeared out of nowhere with no notification to the board. Because no notification was required, I repeated, and they did not appear out of nowhere. They moved in 8 months ago with a moving truck and everything. You have seen them coming and going every day since then. This is not over, Harrison. If you are renting this property in violation of our covenants, there will be consequences. I look forward to hearing from your lawyer, I said, because mine will be very interested in discussing harassment and filing false police reports. Brenda turned on her heel and marched back to her own townhouse 3 doors down, her back rigid with indignation. I took a deep breath and went inside to check on Marcus and Sarah. They were sitting on the couch in the living room, both still visibly shaken. I sat down in the armchair across from them. I am so sorry you had to go through that. What the hell was that about? Marcus asked. We have never had any interaction with that woman. We do not even know her. Brenda Morrison is the kind of HOA president who thinks she runs a small kingdom instead of a neighborhood association. She thrives on power and control. Sarah wiped her eyes with a tissue. Can she actually kick us out? She kept saying we were violating rules. No, she cannot kick you out. Your lease is valid and you have every right to be here. The HOA covenants do not prohibit rentals, despite what she claims. I made absolutely sure of that before I ever decided to rent this place. But what if she tries something else? Sarah asked. I do not feel safe here anymore, knowing she is just a few doors down. That was a legitimate concern, and it made my blood boil. Marcus and Sarah were a young couple in their late 20s. Marcus worked as a software developer, and Sarah was a teacher at a local elementary school. They were exactly the kind of responsible, stable tenants any landlord would dream of having. The fact that Brenda had terrorized them like this was unforgivable. Listen, if she tries anything else, anything at all, you call me immediately, I said. And document everything. Take photos, save emails, keep records. If this escalates, we will need evidence of harassment. Over the next few days, things seemed to calm down. Marcus and Sarah did not report any further incidents with Brenda, and I started to hope that maybe she had realized she was in the wrong and would back off. I should have known better. The following Monday, I received a certified letter from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. It was a formal notice of violation, claiming that by renting my property without board approval, I was in breach of the community covenants. The letter demanded that I either cease renting the property immediately or face a fine of $500 per day until the violation was corrected. It also stated that continued non-compliance could result in the HOA placing a lien on my property. I read the letter 3 times, my anger growing with each pass. This was absolutely ridiculous. I immediately called my lawyer, Daniel Chen, who had helped me with the original property purchase and lease agreements. Harrison, good to hear from you, Daniel said when he answered. What can I do for you? I need you to review something. The HOA is claiming I am in violation of the covenants by renting my property. I scanned the letter and emailed it to him. There was silence on the line as Daniel read through the document. Okay, this is interesting. They are citing Section 12, Paragraph 4, which, as you and I both know, refers to ownership changes, not rental agreements. That is exactly what I told the HOA president when she called the police on my tenants last week claiming they were squatters. She did what? Daniel's voice rose in disbelief. I filled him in on everything that had happened with Brenda, the police visit, and her accusations. By the time I finished, Daniel was practically sputtering with indignation. "Harrison, this is textbook harassment. What she did could potentially be criminal, depending on how we want to pursue it. Right now, I just want her to leave my tenants alone and drop this bogus violation claim. I will draft a response to the HOA letter. We will cite the specific language in the covenants that permits rentals and make it crystal clear that their interpretation is incorrect. We will also include a warning that any further harassment of your tenants or attempts to fine you without legal basis will result in legal action." Perfect. How long will that take? I can have it done by end of day tomorrow. In the meantime, do not respond to the HOA directly. Let me handle all communication. I agreed and hung up, feeling slightly better knowing I had legal representation. But that small comfort was shattered the next day when Marcus called me again. "Harrison, you are not going to believe this. We just got a notice on our door saying our vehicles are parked illegally and will be towed within 24 hours if we do not move them." "Where are your vehicles parked?" "In our driveway, exactly where they have been parked for the past 8 months. I closed my eyes and counted to 10. "Let me guess. The notice is from Brenda Morrison." "How did you know?" "Because she is escalating. Take photos of the notice and your vehicles in the driveway. Send them to me. And do not move your cars." That evening, I drove back to Meadowbrook Estates to see the situation for myself. Sure enough, there was a bright orange notice stuck to both Marcus's sedan and Sarah's small SUV, both of which were parked properly in the driveway of the townhouse. The notice stated that vehicles must be parked in garages overnight, and that driveway parking was prohibited between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. I walked around the neighborhood, looking at other properties. At least a dozen homes had vehicles parked in their driveways. I took photos of every single one, making sure to capture the house numbers and the cars. The next morning, I forwarded all the photos to Daniel along with the parking notice. His response was immediate. "This is selective enforcement and discrimination. We have them." Daniel's strongly worded letter to the HOA was delivered that Friday. In it, he systematically dismantled their violation claim, cited specific sections of the covenant that permitted rentals, and included photographic evidence of selective enforcement regarding the parking rules. He concluded with a warning that any further harassment would result in a lawsuit for damages and legal fees. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. But I had severely underestimated Brenda Morrison's stubbornness and her willingness to abuse her position. 2 weeks later, Marcus called me in a panic. "Harrison, we just got a notice saying the HOA is shutting off our water for non-payment of fees." "What fees?" "I pay the HOA dues as part of the property ownership." That is what I told them, but they said there are special assessment fees for renters that total $1,800, and if we do not pay within 48 hours, they will shut off the water. They cannot do that. Water shutoff would require a court order, and there are no special assessment fees for renters. This is completely fabricated. I called Daniel immediately, and he filed an emergency motion with the county court to prevent any utility shutoff and to force the HOA to prove the legitimacy of their claims. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. In the days leading up to the hearing, things got worse. Marcus and Sarah started receiving noise complaints every single night, all filed by Brenda Morrison. She claimed they were having loud parties, playing music at excessive volumes and disturbing the peace. All of this was completely false. Marcus and Sarah were quiet, introverted people who rarely had visitors, and were usually in bed by 10 p.m. The HOA also sent them a notice saying their lawn was not being maintained to community standards, and that they would be fined $200 if it was not corrected within 72 hours. I drove out to look at the lawn myself. It was perfectly maintained, green and trimmed, identical to every other lawn in the neighborhood. It became crystal clear that Brenda was on a vendetta. She was throwing every possible violation and complaint at Marcus and Sarah, hoping something would stick. What she did not realize was that every single one of these actions was documenting her harassment and building our legal case. The day of the hearing arrived. Daniel, Marcus, Sarah, and I met at the county courthouse at 9 in the morning. We had binders full of evidence. The original lease agreement, HOA covenant documents with highlighted sections, photos of the property, records of all the bogus violations and complaints, and timestamps showing the pattern of harassment. Brenda showed up with the HOA's lawyer, a tired-looking man named Gerald Spencer who looked like he already regretted taking this case. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Reynolds, reviewed the filings before calling the hearing to order. This is a motion to prevent utility shutoff and to address claims of HOA covenant violations, Judge Reynolds said. Mr. Chen, you are representing the property owner and tenants. Yes, Your Honor, Daniel stood. We are asking the court to permanently prohibit the HOA from shutting off utilities to the property and to issue a restraining order against further harassment of the tenants. Those are serious allegations, Judge Reynolds said. Mr. Spencer, what is the HOA's position? Gerald Spencer stood, shuffling his papers. Your Honor, the HOA maintains that Mr. Fletcher is in violation of the community covenants by renting his property without proper notification and approval from the board. The fees assessed are legitimate charges related to this violation. Let me see the covenant section you are citing, Judge Reynolds said. Spencer provided a copy, and Judge Reynolds spent several minutes reading it carefully. Her expression grew increasingly skeptical. Mr. Spencer, this section appears to refer to changes in property ownership, not rental agreements. Can you point me to specific language that prohibits or requires approval for rentals? Spencer flipped through his papers. Your Honor, the HOA board interprets this section to include any change in occupancy. Interpretation is one thing, but the actual language of the contract is what matters. Mr. Chen, do you have evidence that this interpretation is incorrect? Daniel stood again. Yes, Your Honor. We have the original covenant document with legal annotations showing that rental agreements were specifically excluded from this notification requirement. The drafting attorney confirmed this in writing when the covenants were created 15 years ago. We also have evidence that numerous other properties in Meadowbrook Estates are currently rented, and none of them have been subject to these requirements or fees. Is that true, Mr. Spencer? Judge Reynolds asked. Spencer looked uncomfortable. I would have to verify that information, Your Honor. I have verification right here, Daniel said, pulling out another document. This is a list of 8 properties in Meadowbrook Estates that are currently rented, according to public tax records. None of them have been assessed special fees or required to obtain board approval. Judge Reynolds took the document and reviewed it. This appears to be selective enforcement, Mr. Spencer. Can you explain why Mr. Fletcher's property is being singled out? The HOA president, Miss Morrison, has concerns about the conduct of the current tenants, Spencer said weakly. What concerns specifically? Noise complaints, property maintenance issues, parking violations. Daniel immediately spoke up. Your Honor, we have evidence showing that every single one of those complaints is false and part of a pattern of harassment. The noise complaints were filed on nights when the tenants were not even home. The property maintenance issue claimed the lawn was overgrown when photographic evidence shows it was properly maintained. The parking violation notice was issued for vehicles parked in their own driveway, which is standard practice throughout the neighborhood. May I see that evidence? Judge Reynolds asked. Daniel handed over one of our binders. Judge Reynolds spent the next 10 minutes going through it page by page. Her expression grew darker with each passing minute. Mr. Spencer, this is deeply troubling. These documents suggest a systematic campaign of harassment against these tenants. Is Miss Morrison present in court today? Yes, Your Honor. She is in the gallery. Miss Morrison, please come forward. Brenda stood and walked to the front of the courtroom, her expression defiant. Miss Morrison, can you explain to me why you filed a police report claiming these tenants were squatters when you had no evidence to support that claim? Brenda lifted her chin. I had every reason to believe they were squatters, Your Honor. They appeared at the property without any notification to the HOA board. Did you attempt to contact the property owner before calling the police? I did not have his contact information. The property records are public, Miss Morrison. Mr. Fletcher's contact information was readily available. Why did you not attempt to verify the situation before involving law enforcement? Brenda hesitated. I felt it was an urgent matter that required immediate attention. Urgent based on what? The fact that people were living in a house. Judge Reynolds's tone was sharp. Miss Morrison, filing a false police report is a serious matter. Claiming someone is a squatter when you have no evidence to support that claim is not just irresponsible, it is potentially criminal. I did not file a false report, Brenda protested. I genuinely believed they were not supposed to be there. Based on your belief alone, not on any actual evidence, Judge Reynolds said. She turned to the prosecutor who was present for court matters. I want you to review this case and determine if charges should be filed for filing a false police report. Brenda's face went pale. Your Honor, that is not necessary. I was simply trying to protect the community. By harassing innocent people, by making up violations, by threatening to shut off their water, Judge Reynolds shook her head. This is an abuse of your position as HOA president, and it stops now. She turned back to Daniel and Gerald Spencer. Here is my ruling. The HOA's claim that Mr. Fletcher is in violation of the community covenants is denied. The covenant language clearly does not require notification or approval for rental agreements. The assessed fees are invalid and must be refunded if any payments were made. The HOA is permanently prohibited from shutting off utilities to this property or any other property without a valid court order based on legitimate grounds. She paused and looked directly at Brenda. Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting Miss Morrison and the HOA from any further contact with the tenants, except as required for legitimate HOA business that applies equally to all residents. Any further harassment will result in contempt of court charges. Do you understand, Miss Morrison? Yes, Your Honor, Brenda said quietly, all her earlier bravado gone. Mr. Fletcher, Mr. Chen, I apologize that you and your tenants had to endure this situation. You are entitled to file a civil suit for damages if you choose to do so. Thank you, Your Honor, Daniel said. We will consider that option. As we left the courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Marcus and Sarah were both visibly relieved, holding hands and smiling for the first time in weeks. Is it really over? Sarah asked. The judge issued a restraining order, I said. If Brenda tries anything else, she will be in contempt of court, and there is a possibility she could face criminal charges for the false police report. I still cannot believe she went that far, Marcus said. All of this because we were renting a house. Some people cannot handle not having control, Daniel explained. HOA board members like Brenda Morrison see themselves as rulers of their little domains. When someone does not bow to their authority, they lash out. Over the next few weeks, things finally settled down. Brenda did not file any more complaints, did not send any more violation notices, and seemed to avoid even looking in the direction of my townhouse when she left her own home. Marcus and Sarah could finally relax and enjoy living in their home without constant fear of harassment. But the story was not quite over. About 6 weeks after the court hearing, I received a call from Daniel. "Harrison, I have interesting news. The prosecutor decided to file charges against Brenda Morrison for filing a false police report." "Really? I thought they might let it slide." "Normally they might, but Judge Reynolds sent a strong recommendation to the prosecutor's office. Plus, when they investigated further, they found that Brenda had filed similar false reports against other residents in the past. There is a pattern of behavior here." "What kind of charges is she facing?" "It is a misdemeanor, but it could result in fines and possibly probation. More importantly, the HOA board is moving to remove her as president." Several other homeowners came forward with their own complaints about her behavior once word got out about what she did to your tenants. That news made me smile. Justice was finally being served. The criminal case against Brenda took a few months to wind through the system. During that time, I learned more about her reign of terror as HOA president. She had targeted at least 4 other homeowners with similar harassment campaigns. One elderly couple had been fined repeatedly for supposed landscaping violations that did not exist. A single mother had been threatened with a lien on her property because her children's toys were visible in the backyard, which Brenda claimed violated aesthetic standards. A retired veteran had been issued violation after violation for parking his truck in his own driveway because Brenda decided it was too large and unsightly. All of these people came forward once they learned about the court case. Together, they formed a coalition to remove Brenda from the HOA board and reform the association's governance. I attended one of their meetings and was impressed by their organization and determination. "We let her have too much power for too long," said Robert Chen, the retired veteran. "We just wanted to live in peace, so we paid her bogus fines and tried to stay out of her way. But what she did to your tenants was the last straw." "I appreciate all of you standing up now," I said. Marcus and Sarah were terrified. They thought they were going to lose their home over nothing. "No one should have to live like that," said Margaret Torres, the single mother. "This is supposed to be a community, not a dictatorship." The coalition collected signatures from over 70% of the homeowners, calling for Brenda's removal as HOA president, and a complete review of the association's policies. They also voted to implement new bylaws limiting the power of the president and requiring board decisions to be made by majority vote rather than unilateral action. Brenda fought the removal at first, showing up to meetings and arguing that she had done nothing wrong. But when the criminal charges were formally filed against her, the other board members had no choice but to suspend her from her position pending the outcome of the trial. The trial itself was brief. Brenda's lawyer tried to argue that she had made an honest mistake and genuinely believed Marcus and Sarah were squatters. But the prosecutor presented evidence of the pattern of false reports and harassment. They also called me as a witness. Taking the stand was nerve-wracking, but I told the truth about everything that had happened. I described the phone call from Marcus, the scene with the police officers, Brenda's accusations, and the subsequent campaign of harassment with fake violations and threats. Mr. Fletcher did miss. Morrison ever attempt to verify the situation before calling the police? The prosecutor asked. No. She never contacted me, never asked to see the lease agreement, never tried to confirm anything. She just assumed and called 911. And what impact did this have on your tenants? They were traumatized. Sarah was crying. Marcus was terrified they would be arrested. They are good people who had done nothing wrong, and they were being treated like criminals. The defense attorney tried to paint Brenda as a concerned community member who was just trying to protect the neighborhood. But when Marcus took the stand and described how Brenda had continued to harass them, even after the police confirmed the lease was valid, it became clear this was not about concern. It was about control and retaliation. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Brenda Morrison guilty of filing a false police report. The judge sentenced her to 6 months probation, 200 hours of community service, and a fine of $2,000. He also ordered her to pay restitution to Marcus and Sarah for the emotional distress she had caused. Miss Morrison, you abused your position of authority in this community, the judge said. You targeted innocent people and used the police as a weapon in your personal vendetta. This behavior is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. I hope you use this probation period to reflect on your actions and make better choices in the future. Brenda stood there stone-faced as the sentence was read. She did not apologize, did not show any remorse. She simply nodded and left the courtroom with her lawyer. After the trial, the HOA board officially removed Brenda from her position as president. The homeowners elected a new president, a retired school principal named Thomas Anderson, who seemed reasonable and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty power games. One of Thomas's first acts as president was to send formal apology letters to Marcus and Sarah, as well as to all the other homeowners Brenda had targeted. He also implemented new policies requiring all violation notices to be reviewed by the full board before being issued and establishing an appeal process for homeowners who felt they were being unfairly targeted. Marcus and Sarah decided to stay in the townhouse when their initial lease term ended. We signed a new lease for another year, and they told me they finally felt comfortable in the neighborhood now that Brenda was gone. It is like a weight has been lifted, Sarah said when we met to sign the new lease. We actually enjoy living here now. The neighbors have been so apologetic and welcoming since everything came out. I am glad, I said. You two never should have had to go through any of that. At least some good came out of it, Marcus added. The HOA is actually functional now. They are planning community events, maintaining the common areas properly, and not harassing anyone over ridiculous violations. Life in Meadowbrook Estates improved dramatically under the new HOA leadership. The community garden that had been neglected during Brenda's reign was restored. The playground equipment was updated. Monthly community gatherings were organized where neighbors could actually get to know each other rather than living in fear of violation notices. I continued to own the townhouse and rent it to Marcus and Sarah for several more years. They eventually bought their own home in a different neighborhood, and I found new tenants who were equally wonderful. The HOA never gave me or any of my tenants any trouble again. As for Brenda Morrison, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she completed her probation and community service, then sold her townhouse and moved out of Meadowbrook Estates. Nobody seemed sad to see her go. The whole experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, documentation is everything. If we had not kept meticulous records of every interaction, every fake violation, every false accusation, we might not have been able to prove the pattern of harassment. Second, standing up to bullies is important even when it is difficult and expensive. Brenda had counted on people being too intimidated or too tired to fight back. When we refused to back down, her whole house of cards collapsed. Third, one bad person in a position of power can poison an entire community, but good people working together can fix the damage. I stayed in touch with several of the homeowners from Meadowbrook Estates, particularly Robert Chen and Margaret Torres. We would meet for coffee occasionally and laugh about the whole situation in retrospect, though it had been anything but funny while it was happening. "You know what the craziest part is?" Robert said during one of our coffee meetups about a year after the trial. "Brenda never once admitted she was wrong. Even after being convicted, even after being removed from the board, she still believed she was the victim." "Some people cannot handle being held accountable," Margaret said. "They would rather rewrite history in their minds than accept responsibility for their actions." "I just feel bad for Marcus and Sarah," I said. "They were caught in the crossfire of Brenda's power trip through no fault of their own." "But they stood up for themselves with your help," Robert pointed out. "And by doing that, they helped free the rest of us from her tyranny. That takes courage." The civil suit that Daniel had mentioned as a possibility never materialized. Marcus and Sarah decided that the criminal conviction and the restitution payment were enough. They did not want to drag the whole thing out any further. They just wanted to move on with their lives. I respected their decision, though part of me thought Brenda deserved to face more consequences for what she had put them through. But at the end of the day, it was their choice to make. The experience did make me much more cautious about HOA-governed properties in the future. When I eventually purchased a second investment property a few years later, I made sure to thoroughly research the HOA board, attend several meetings, and talk to current homeowners about their experiences before closing the deal. I was not going to walk into another Brenda Morrison situation if I could help it. Interestingly, the Meadowbrook Estate situation became somewhat famous in local real estate circles. Daniel wrote an article about it for a property law journal, and it was cited in several cases involving HOA overreach and selective enforcement. The case became an example of how individual homeowners could successfully fight back against abusive HOA boards. I even got a few calls from other property owners and tenants dealing with similar situations, asking for advice. I always told them the same thing: document everything, know your rights, do not be afraid to lawyer up if necessary, and do not let bullies intimidate you into giving up. Looking back on the whole saga now, I am grateful for how it turned out, even though it was incredibly stressful while it was happening. Marcus and Sarah got justice. Brenda faced consequences for her actions. The Meadowbrook Estates community was reformed and improved. And I learned valuable lessons about standing up for what is right even when it is difficult. The day the judge issued his ruling in that courtroom was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Seeing Brenda's face when she realized she had lost, that her tactics had backfired, that she was facing actual consequences for her behavior, that was worth all the stress and legal fees. But more than that, seeing Marcus and Sarah smile again, seeing them relax and feel safe in their home, that was what really mattered. They were good people who deserved to live in peace, and I was proud that I had been able to help make that happen. The neighborhood culture shift after Brenda's departure was remarkable. People who had been afraid to even make eye contact with their neighbors for fear of somehow attracting Brenda's attention suddenly started having block parties and cookouts. The community Facebook page, which had been a minefield of passive-aggressive posts and violation warnings during Brenda's reign, became actually friendly and helpful. Thomas Anderson proved to be an excellent HOA president. He ran the association like an actual community organization rather than a fiefdom. He was responsive to homeowner concerns, transparent about the budget and spending, and focused on genuine issues like infrastructure maintenance and community safety rather than manufactured violations. Under his leadership, the HOA even managed to negotiate better rates for services like snow removal and landscaping, which resulted in lower dues for everyone. It was amazing what could be accomplished when the person in charge actually cared about the community rather than just their own power. I attended a few HOA meetings after Thomas took over, just to see the difference. The contrast was striking. During Brenda's time, meetings had been tense affairs where homeowners were afraid to speak up. Now they were collaborative discussions, where people felt comfortable raising concerns and offering suggestions. At one meeting, a homeowner suggested installing solar-powered lights along the walking paths in the common areas for better safety at night. During Brenda's reign, she would have shot down the idea immediately or found some reason to oppose it. Thomas said it was a great suggestion and formed a committee to research options and costs. The lights were installed 3 months later. That is how an HOA is supposed to function. It is supposed to maintain and improve the community, not terrorize the people who live there. Marcus and Sarah became good friends of mine through all of this. We would have dinner together every few months, and they would update me on life in Meadowbrook Estates. They both got promotions at their jobs. They adopted a second dog. They made close friends with several of their neighbors. This is the life we thought we were signing up for when we rented the townhouse, Marcus told me during one dinner. A nice, quiet community where we could just live our lives. Brenda almost ruined that for us. But she did not succeed, Sarah added. And now we have this amazing story to tell about the time we took down a tyrant HOA president. We laughed about it then, but I knew it was still painful for them in many ways. The trauma of being accused of being squatters, of having police officers at your door, of facing constant harassment, that does not just go away overnight. They told me they had gone to therapy for a few months after everything was over to process what they had been through. I was glad they had taken that step to take care of their mental health. The therapist told us what Brenda did was a form of institutional abuse, Sarah explained. She used her position of power to target and harm us, and that kind of experience can have lasting effects. But we are working through it, Marcus said. And knowing that she faced consequences, that helped a lot. We were not just victims. We fought back and won. That resilience and determination was admirable. A lot of people would have just moved out and tried to forget the whole thing. Marcus and Sarah stayed and fought for their right to live in peace. They refused to be driven away by a bully. The financial impact of the whole situation was significant. Between legal fees, time off work for court appearances, and general stress, it had cost me several $1,000s, but it was worth every penny. Some things are more important than money, and protecting my tenants from harassment was one of them. Daniel's fees were substantial, but he had been worth every cent. He had built an airtight case, anticipated every move the HOA might make, and presented our position with clarity and precision. When I thanked him after the trial, he told me it had been one of the most satisfying cases of his career. I see a lot of HOA abuse cases, Daniel said. Usually they are more subtle. This was so blatant, so egregious, it was almost easy to prove. Brenda Morrison handed us the evidence we needed through her own actions. The prosecutor who had handled the criminal case against Brenda told me something similar when I ran into her at a local coffee shop months after the trial. In all my years prosecuting cases, I have never seen someone so determined to destroy themselves, she said. Every time we thought she might show some remorse or try to make amends, she doubled down. Even her own lawyer was frustrated with her. Brenda's refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing was almost pathological. Even faced with overwhelming evidence, even after being convicted in a court of law, she maintained that she had done nothing wrong. That level of self-delusion was honestly frightening. I wondered sometimes what made someone become like Brenda Morrison. What life experiences or personality traits led to that kind of behavior? Was it a need for control stemming from feeling powerless in other areas of her life? Was it narcissism? Was it just plain meanness? I would never know, and ultimately it did not matter. Understanding why someone is a bully does not excuse their behavior or undo the harm they have caused. Brenda had made her choices, and she had paid the price for them. The ripple effects of the case extended beyond just Meadowbrook Estates. Other HOA boards in Chapel Hill and the surrounding area took notice. Several of them implemented reforms to their own governance structures to prevent similar abuses. Some even reached out to Thomas Anderson to ask about the changes he had made and how they were working. The local media picked up the story after the trial. A reporter from the Chapel Hill newspaper interviewed me, Marcus, Sarah, and several other affected homeowners. The resulting article, titled HOA President Convicted After Harassment Campaign, sparked a broader conversation about HOA governance and accountability. I did several radio interviews and even appeared on a local television news segment about the case. The response was overwhelming. My inbox was flooded with messages from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Some were worse than what we had experienced. Others were similar, but the people had not fought back. Each message reinforced for me how important it had been to stand up to Brenda. We were not just fighting for Marcus and Sarah. We were fighting against a system that too often allowed petty tyrants to abuse their power without consequences. One message that particularly stuck with me came from an elderly woman named Helen who lived in a different HOA community in North Carolina. She wrote that her HOA board had been threatening to foreclose on her home over minor violations, and she had felt hopeless until she read about our case. She used the information from the article to find a lawyer and fight back. She ended up winning her case, and the HOA board members who had targeted her were removed. "Your story gave me hope that I could stand up for myself," Helen wrote. "Thank you for not backing down." Messages like that made all the stress and expense worthwhile. If our experience could help even one other person escape a similar situation, then it had been worth it. As the years passed, the memory of Brenda Morrison faded in Meadowbrook Estates. New homeowners moved in who had never experienced her reign of terror. The community continued to thrive under reasonable leadership. Life went on, but I never forgot the lessons learned from that experience. I became an advocate for HOA reform, attending town council meetings, and speaking about the need for oversight and accountability in homeowners associations. Some states have strong laws protecting homeowners from HOA abuse. North Carolina was not one of them at the time, but I worked with others to try to change that. We formed a coalition called Homeowners United for Fair HOAs. We lobbied the state legislature for reforms like requiring HOA boards to carry insurance against lawsuits for improper actions, mandating training for board members on property law and fair housing, and creating an ombudsman office where homeowners could report abuse. Progress was slow. The HOA industry lobby was powerful and opposed most reforms, but we did achieve some victories. We got a bill passed requiring HOAs to provide clear written procedures for disputing violations and imposing fines. We got another bill passed prohibiting HOAs from shutting off utilities without a court order. Small steps, but important ones. Marcus and Sarah eventually moved out of the townhouse when they bought their own home, as I mentioned before. Their new home was not in an HOA community. They told me they had learned their lesson about the risks of HOA governance and wanted the freedom to live without worrying about violation notices. I understood their decision, though I was sorry to lose such great tenants. We stayed in touch, and I continued to rent the townhouse to other responsible tenants without any further issues from the HOA. Years after everything happened, I ran into Brenda Morrison by chance at a grocery store in Durham. She was in the produce section, examining avocados. For a moment, I considered just walking past her and avoiding any interaction, but something made me stop. "Hello, Brenda," I said. She looked up, and I saw recognition flash across her face, followed by something that might have been shame or anger. It was hard to tell. "Harrison," she said curtly. "How have you been?" "Fine." Her tone made it clear she did not want to have this conversation. "Look, I know we are not friends and never will be," I said, "but I hope you have had time to reflect on what happened and maybe learned something from it." Brenda put down the avocado she had been holding and looked at me directly for the first time. "You ruined my life." I felt anger flare in my chest. "I did not ruin your life, Brenda. You did that yourself when you chose to harass innocent people and file false police reports." "I was protecting my community," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "Other shoppers were starting to glance our way. You were abusing your power. There is a difference. Those people should not have been there. You violated the rules." "No, I did not, and a court confirmed that." "Multiple courts, actually." Brenda's jaw tightened. "You never understood what it takes to maintain community standards. People like you come in and disrupt things, bring in renters who do not care about the neighborhood." Marcus and Sarah cared deeply about the neighborhood. They maintained the property beautifully and were good neighbors. You targeted them because you could not control them. "I do not have to listen to this," Brenda said, grabbing her shopping basket and starting to walk away. "No, you do not," I called after her, "but maybe you should." She kept walking without looking back. I stood there in the produce section feeling frustrated and sad. Even after everything, even after facing legal consequences and losing her position, Brenda had learned nothing. She still saw herself as the victim. She still believed she had done nothing wrong. Some people are simply incapable of self-reflection or personal growth. Brenda Morrison was apparently one of them. I told Marcus and Sarah about the encounter when we met for coffee later that week. They were not surprised by Brenda's continued refusal to accept responsibility. "People like that never change," Marcus said. "They go to their graves believing they were right and everyone else was wrong." "It is sad, really," Sarah added. "She could have just left us alone. She could have been a good HOA president who actually helped the community. Instead, she chose to be a tyrant and it cost her everything." "Do you ever regret fighting back?" I asked them. "Was it worth all the stress and trouble?" They looked at each other, one of those wordless communications that long-term couples develop. "Absolutely," Marcus said. "If we had just rolled over and moved out, she would have kept doing it to other people. By fighting back, we helped change the whole community for the better." Plus, Sarah added with a slight smile, there was something satisfying about watching her face when the judge issued that restraining order. We all laughed at that. It was true. There had been a certain justice in seeing Brenda held accountable for her actions. The experience shaped how I approached property ownership and tenant relationships going forward. I became more proactive about protecting my tenants' rights. I made sure they knew I had their backs if any issues arose. I maintained open communication, so they felt comfortable coming to me with problems before they escalated. I also became much more selective about where I purchased investment properties. HOA-governed communities were not necessarily bad, but they required careful vetting. I would attend multiple HOA meetings before purchasing, review several years of meeting minutes, and talk to as many current homeowners as possible to get a sense of how the board operated. Those precautions paid off. My subsequent investment properties were all in communities with reasonable, well-run HOAs. No drama, no harassment, just normal community governance focused on maintaining property values and quality of life. The townhouse in Meadowbrook Estates remained a solid investment. Property values in the area increased steadily over the years. The community improvements made under Thomas Anderson's leadership made it an even more desirable place to live. I eventually sold the property about 8 years after the whole incident with Brenda, making a substantial profit. The new owners were a young family with 2 kids. I met with them before closing and told them about the history of the property and the HOA. They appreciated the transparency and were excited to move into a community with such strong, positive leadership. We looked at a lot of neighborhoods, the husband told me, but Meadowbrook Estates really stood out. Everyone we talked to raved about how well run the HOA is and how friendly the community is. I smiled, thinking about how different things had been during Brenda's time. It is a great community now. You are going to love it there. As I drove away from the townhouse for the last time after closing, I felt a mix of nostalgia and relief. That property had been the source of so much stress during the Brenda Morrison saga, but it had also been the catalyst for positive change that affected many people's lives. Marcus and Sarah were thriving in their own home. The Meadowbrook Estates community was healthy and happy. Brenda had faced consequences for her actions. The legal precedent from our case had helped other homeowners in similar situations, and I had learned invaluable lessons about standing up for what is right. Sometimes the hardest battles are the most important ones to fight. Sometimes standing up to a bully, even when it is expensive and stressful and time-consuming, is exactly what needs to happen. Not just for yourself, but for everyone else that bully might target if not stopped. The whole experience reinforced my belief that ordinary people have more power than they realize. We did not have unlimited resources. We were not particularly connected or influential. But we had documentation, persistence, and a willingness to fight for what was right. That turned out to be enough. Years later, I still get occasional messages from people who read about our case or heard me speak about HOA reform. They tell me their own stories, ask for advice, or just thank me for speaking out about the issue. Each message reminds me that advocacy matters, that sharing your story can help others, and that standing up to injustice creates ripples that extend far beyond your immediate situation. I think about Brenda Morrison sometimes and wonder if she ever gained any perspective on what she did. I doubt it based on our encounter at the grocery store, but maybe somewhere deep down there is a flicker of awareness. Or maybe not. Some people are too invested in their own narratives to ever see the truth, but it does not matter anymore. She is not my problem, and she is not hurting anyone in Meadowbrook Estates. The community moved on and is better for her absence. Marcus and Sarah moved on and built a happy life. I moved on and continued investing in real estate with hard-won wisdom about HOA governance. The story had a good ending, which is more than many HOA horror stories can claim. Justice was served, lessons were learned, and positive changes resulted. In a world where accountability is often lacking, especially for people in positions of petty power, our experience stood as a reminder that sometimes good does triumph over abuse and tyranny. I hope that anyone reading this who is dealing with a similar situation takes courage from our story. Document everything. Know your rights. Get a good lawyer if needed. Do not be intimidated. And remember that you are not just fighting for yourself, you are fighting for everyone that bully might target next. Standing up to Brenda Morrison was one of the hardest things I have ever done. But it was also one of the most important, and I would do it again in a heartbeat.